Nobody at Crestwood High School had ever asked Elena Voss a single question about her life before she started monitoring study hall. That was, in the end, exactly how the United States government had designed her to disappear. Elena was 34, unremarkable by design rather than by nature, with pale gray eyes that missed nothing, and a habit of sitting at the back of any room she occupied, facing whatever door happened to be nearest. She had held the position of study hall supervisor at Crestwood for 2 years, a job that existed somewhere below substitute teaching and slightly above hall monitor in the school's unofficial hierarchy of respect, and she had never once corrected anyone who assumed that meant she wasn't particularly capable of much. "You know you could apply for an actual teaching position," Assistant Principal Marvin Ferris told her once, leaning against the doorframe of the cavernous, dimly lit library annex, where 40-some students spent their off periods pretending to do homework. Ferris was a compact, fussy man who had never quite gotten over not being selected for the head principal job 3 years earlier, and he tended to compensate for it by micromanaging every part of the building that couldn't fight back. "You've got a degree, don't you? Biology, I think it said on your file. Seems like a waste, sitting back here babysitting." "I like it back here," Elena said, not looking up from the stack of missed assignment slips she was sorting. "Suit yourself," Ferris said in the particular tone of a man who had decided, without much evidence, that a person's lack of ambition explained everything interesting about them. He left without waiting for a response, the way he always did, and Elena went back to her slips, unbothered. It wasn't only Ferris. The other supervisory staff, a rotating cast of coaches and retired teachers who split study hall duty across the week, treated Elena with the mild, unthinking condescension reserved for people whose jobs seemed too easy to respect. Coach Dwayne Pratt, who covered the annex on Wednesdays, liked to joke that Elena's entire skill set consisted of confiscating phones and pretending to read paperback thrillers, a joke he'd made often enough that it had calcified into something close to the official staff opinion of her. Elena let it exist the way she let most things exist, unchallenged, because correcting it would have required explanations she had no intention of ever giving. What Marvin Ferris did not know, what nobody at Crestwood High School knew, because it was never meant to be known by anyone outside a small, tightly compartmented circle of people who had signed their names to documents thicker than most legal contracts, was that Elena Voss had spent 8 years as a Special Operations Combat Medic attached to a joint Special Operations Task Force, whose missions never appeared in any newspaper, whose casualties were never listed on any public memorial, and whose very existence most senior officers in the conventional military were not cleared to discuss. She had deployed more times than she could accurately count on missions that had, by design, left no paper trail. Her official discharge paperwork listed her separation reason as administrative and her prior duty as classified, 4 words that closed every door a curious hiring manager might otherwise have opened. She had a technique, once known among a very small number of people as the Voss maneuver, a modified approach to controlling catastrophic junctional hemorrhage in the field, using nothing but a standard-issue tourniquet, a length of gauze, and a pressure point. Most trauma manuals didn't bother teaching, because it required an almost surgical precision under conditions no manual could replicate. She had taught it to exactly 6 other medics across her career, 3 of whom were still alive. The other 3 were not, and one of them, a 24-year-old Delta Force operator named Jake Sorensen, had died under her hands on a rooftop overseas, despite every single thing she had done exactly right, because sometimes right wasn't enough, and no amount of training had ever prepared her for how much that particular kind of loss simply refused to leave. She could still, 6 years later, recall the exact texture of that night, with a clarity she wished she couldn't. The mission had gone bad in the way missions sometimes do, not through anyone's mistake, but through simple, brutal chance. A secondary device none of the pre-mission intelligence had flagged, detonating close enough to Jake that the shrapnel had opened his femoral artery in a way that made every second matter more than the last. She remembered the particular weight of him in her arms as she dragged him behind cover, remembered the sound he made when she packed the wound, remembered talking to him the entire time, in a low, steady voice about nothing at all, his favorite football team, the diner near base with the terrible coffee, anything to keep him tethered to the sound of her voice instead of the growing cold spreading through his body. She remembered the exact moment his eyes stopped tracking her face, and the specific, hollow silence that followed it, a silence that had nothing to do with the gunfire still audible somewhere in the distance. She had done everything the training manuals said, everything her own modified technique was built to accomplish, and it had not been enough, and no commendation, no quiet ceremony in a room with no windows, no folded flag delivered to a mother in Ohio, had ever once made that arithmetic feel survivable. She had left the service 11 months after Jake's funeral, and she had built a life afterwards so quiet, so deliberately unremarkable, that a windowless library annex full of bored teenagers had felt, for 2 years, like the closest thing to peace she had found. Crestwood's students had their own theories about her, the way teenagers always invent stories to fill the space where information should be. Some said she'd been in witness protection, some said she'd been a spy, which was closer to true than any of them realized, though none of them believed it seriously enough to ask. A junior named Priya Anand had once dared a friend to ask Ms. Voss directly what she used to do before Crestwood, and when the friend actually asked, Elena had looked up from her book, considered the question for exactly 3 seconds, and said, "I worked for the government," in a tone so flat and final that nobody had ever tried asking again. The ice storm rolled through the region on a Thursday in early February, the kind of storm meteorologists spend days warning about, and half the town ignores anyway, and it dropped nearly 2 inches of freezing rain onto a roof that Crestwood's aging maintenance budget had been patching, rather than replacing for the better part of a decade. By the time the first period bell rang, icicles as thick as a man's wrist hung from the gutters above the west wing, and the old steel trusses supporting the library annex's flat roof were groaning under a weight nobody in the building administration had bothered to calculate. The district had sent a memo 2 years earlier recommending a full roof assessment for the older wings of the building, a memo that had been read, filed, and quietly forgotten in the way budget memos about buildings that hadn't fallen down yet usually were. Marvin Ferris had mentioned it once in a staff meeting, gotten a lukewarm response about competing capital priorities, and never brought it up again. Nobody at Crestwood High School had any particular reason to think about roof trusses on an ordinary Thursday morning, least of all the 40 students filing into the annex for third-period study hall, backpacks slung over shoulders, half of them already half asleep. Elena noticed the sound before anyone else did, the way she noticed most things. A low, grinding creak overhead, subtle enough that the 40-odd students scattered across the annex's tables barely registered it over the hum of fluorescent lights and the click of laptop keys. She had heard sounds like that before, structural groans in buildings that weren't built to hold what they were currently holding, and every instinct she'd spent 2 years trying to let go dormant snapped instantly back to attention. "Everyone up," she said, standing so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the tile. "Now. Toward the front doors. Don't stop for your bags." A few students glanced up, confused. "Ms. Voss, we've got 20 minutes left," one boy said. "Now," Elena repeated, and something in the flatness of her voice, a register none of them had heard from her before, got nearly everyone moving before she'd finished the second syllable. The roof came down 4 seconds later. It wasn't a clean collapse. Part of the aging steel truss system buckled first near the room's rear corner, dropping a section of ceiling tile and insulation onto the back tables in a heavy, choking cloud of dust, immediately followed by a secondary failure near the center of the room, as the weight redistributed onto joists that had no business bearing it. Several students who hadn't cleared the room in time went down under falling debris, screaming, and the room plunged into a strange, muffled half-darkness as dust filled the air and the overhead lights flickered and died. Elena was already moving before the dust had settled, her mind sliding into a cold, focused clarity that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with 8 years of training that no amount of quiet suburban living had ever managed to erase. "Anyone who can walk, get to the doors and keep moving. Don't look back," she called out, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "If you're pinned, stay still and call out your name." 3 voices answered from the wreckage near the back wall. Elena moved toward the nearest one first, a girl named Priya Anand, half buried under a fallen ceiling section. Her leg bent at an angle that made Elena's stomach tighten even through the practiced calm she'd forced onto her own face. "I've got you," Elena said, crouching beside her, her hands already assessing the leg with a speed and precision that would have looked, to any trained observer, nothing at all like the movements of a study hall supervisor. "Don't move that leg, Priya. I know it hurts. I need you to breathe with me, okay? In through your nose." Behind her, Marvin Ferris had arrived at the annex doorway, drawn by the crash and the screaming, his face going pale at the sight of the collapsed ceiling and the dust-choked room beyond. "Oh my God. Oh my God. Call 911. Somebody call." "Already called," Elena said without turning around, pulling a folded triangular bandage from a small emergency kit clipped inside her cardigan pocket. A kit that, if anyone had bothered to look closely enough over the last 2 years, contained items no ordinary supervisor's bag ever needed. "Ferris, I need every free adult in this building, getting students clear of the doorway and keeping the hallway open. I need someone finding out if that gas line running along the annex's east wall is intact. Go." Ferris, entirely unaccustomed to being given orders by anyone, let alone the quiet woman he'd spent 2 years dismissing, found himself moving before he'd consciously decided to obey. Elena worked her way through the wreckage with a methodical, unhurried speed, splinting Priya's leg with a length of broken shelving and a torn strip of her own cardigan, then moving to the second trapped student, a heavy-set sophomore named Marcus Webb, who had a deep laceration across his scalp, bleeding freely into the dust and debris around him. "Stay with me, Marcus," she said, pressing a folded gauze pad hard against the wound, holding it there with a steady, unyielding pressure. "Head wounds bleed like this. Looks worse than it is, I promise you." "Ms. Voss," Marcus said, his voice shaking, "how do you know how to do this?" "I read a lot," Elena said, and the joke, thin as it was, seemed to steady him slightly. Somewhere behind her, a girl named Tasha Coleman had begun sobbing near the annex doorway, and Elena, without breaking her pressure on Marcus's wound, called out, "Tasha, I need you to breathe for me, sweetheart. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Do it with me. We're going to get everyone out of here, but I need you to help me by staying calm, okay?" The girl's sobbing hitched, then slowed, obedient in the way frightened people often are, when someone else sounds certain enough to follow. The third voice, weaker than the others, came from beneath a heavier section of collapsed truss near the room's center, and by the time Elena reached him, a wiry freshman named Danny Reyes, his breathing had gone shallow and rapid, in a way that made every alarm in her training scream at once. A jagged piece of steel bracket had punched into his lower abdomen when the truss came down, and the dark, spreading stain across his shirt told her exactly how little time she actually had. "Ferris," she called out, her voice sharpening into something that carried across the entire ruined room. "I need that gas line answer, and I need it now, and somebody get me light. My phone's under this rubble somewhere." "The gas is fine. We shut the main valve," Ferris called back, his voice cracking with something between fear and awe as he watched her work. "Elena, what do you need? Tell me what you need." "I need his airway kept clear, and I need pressure on this exact spot," Elena said, guiding Ferris's shaking hands into position over the wound, with a speed that left no room for hesitation. "Hold it there. Don't let go, no matter what he says to you." Danny's eyes fluttered, unfocused, finding Elena's face in the dim light filtering through the broken ceiling. "Am I gonna die, Ms. Voss?" "No," Elena said, in a voice with no room in it for doubt, cutting away his shirt with a small folding knife she'd pulled from somewhere Ferris hadn't even known she was carrying. "You are going to be extremely annoyed with me for ruining your favorite shirt, and that's the worst thing that's going to happen to you today." She found the source of the bleeding with her fingers, a torn vessel just beneath the surface, and applied a technique that 6 people in the entire world had ever been taught by name, her hands moving with a precision that turned the chaotic, dust-choked room briefly, strangely silent, every conscious student watching her work, with the particular stillness reserved for moments that don't make sense yet but clearly matter. By the time the first fire truck's lights washed red across the shattered annex windows, Danny Reyes's bleeding had slowed to a controlled, manageable seep, his pulse steadying under Elena's watchful hand, and the paramedic who finally knelt beside him to take over simply stopped, mid-motion, staring at the exact placement of the pressure point Elena had used. "Who did this?" he said, not quite a question. "I did," Elena said, stepping back, her hands, steady through the entire ordeal, finally trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. "This isn't textbook technique," the paramedic said slowly, studying the wound site. "I've seen this exact approach exactly once before, at a training conference nobody was supposed to talk about afterward." Elena said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that some questions were safer left unanswered, even by silence. All 3 students survived. Priya's leg healed with a rod and 6 screws, and a story she would tell for the rest of her life. Marcus's scalp wound closed with 11 stitches, and considerably less drama than the bleeding had suggested. Danny Reyes spent 4 days in the intensive care unit at County General, and on his second night there, heavily sedated but drifting in and out of consciousness, he told his mother, in a slurred, half-formed sentence, about the study hall lady who'd talked about his shirt while she saved his life. Danny's mother mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it, almost in passing, during a phone call to her own son, a Green Beret currently stationed overseas, who happened to have spent several years running in circles, small enough that certain names, certain techniques, certain very specific approaches to junctional hemorrhage control meant considerably more to him than they would have meant to almost anyone else on Earth. His name was Staff Sergeant Cole Bishop, and when his mother described, secondhand and imprecisely, exactly how the school supervisor had stopped his young cousin's bleeding, Cole Bishop went very quiet on the other end of the phone line, because there was exactly one person he had ever heard of who used a technique that specific, and he had spent the better part of 6 years assuming she'd disappeared off the face of the earth entirely. He made 2 phone calls that night. The first was to a former teammate named Aaron Wexler, who had trained under Elena Voss himself, and had never once stopped hoping she was alive somewhere, doing well, safe from whatever had driven her out so completely after Jake Sorensen's death. The second call was longer, quieter, and ended with both men agreeing that whatever leave they had left in the year, they were spending some of it in a small town they'd never heard of. At a public high school neither of them had any official business visiting. 10 days after the roof came down, on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, 2 men in plain civilian clothes walked into the Crestwood High School front office and asked, politely and without any fanfare at all, whether they might speak with Elena Voss. Marvin Ferris, who had spent the last 10 days treating Elena with a bewildered, careful deference he'd never shown anyone in his professional life, escorted them personally to the library annex, where temporary plywood sheeting now covered the section of ceiling still awaiting proper repair, and where Elena was, as always, sitting at the back table, facing the door. She looked up as they entered, and whatever composure she had spent 2 years building around herself cracked instantly and completely at the sight of them. "Aaron," she said, her voice catching. "Cole." "Hey, Doc," Aaron Wexler said quietly, and the old nickname, unused in 6 years, landed in the room like something physical. Elena stood slowly, her hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline this time. "How did you—" "Your maneuver," Cole Bishop said simply. "There's not a lot of people on this earth who know how to do what you did to that kid's abdomen. You taught exactly 6 of us, and I know for a fact 4 are still breathing because of it. When my aunt described what happened to my cousin Danny, I knew inside of about 10 seconds who'd been standing in that room." Aaron Wexler pulled out the chair across from her and sat, the easy, familiar gesture of a man who had once shared cramped transport helicopters and worse with the woman across from him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, letting 6 years of silence sit in the space between them until it stopped feeling quite so heavy. "We tried for a long time," Aaron said finally. "After you left, Cole tried the VA, I tried a couple contacts still working admin. We even had Reyes, actual name Reyes, funny coincidence, try pulling strings through a buddy at Walter Reed. You didn't leave much of a trail, Elena. You left almost none at all." "That was the idea," Elena said quietly. "We figured," Cole said. "Doesn't mean we stopped looking. Guys from a unit like ours, We don't really get to keep in touch with civilians the normal way. No unit reunions, no Facebook group, nothing that shows up on a records request. You disappear as far as anybody official is concerned. But the men you trained never disappeared you from where it counts. He tapped his own chest, once, without ceremony. You're the reason 4 guys I served with are still walking around annoying their wives instead of names on a wall. That doesn't get forgotten just because you go quiet. Elena's eyes filled, and she made no effort to hide it. Not from these 2 men, not anymore. I never told anyone what I used to do, she said. Not here, not anyone. You didn't have to tell us, Aaron said gently. We already knew. We've been looking for you for 6 years, Elena. Ever since Jake. The name hit the room the way it always hit her, a weight settling behind her ribs that never fully lifted no matter how many years passed. I couldn't save him, she said quietly. I did everything right and I still couldn't save him. We know, Cole said. We were there. Nobody who was on that rooftop ever once thought it was your failure, Elena. His mother knows what you did for him. She's known for 6 years. She's been trying to find you too, just to say thank you. And you disappeared so completely that even we couldn't track you down. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, worn item wrapped in a handkerchief, unfolding it carefully to reveal a set of dog tags, dulled with age, the name stamped into the metal reading Sorensen, Jacob T. His mother wanted you to have these, Cole said quietly. She said you were the last person who held his hand. She said that means something that outranks every medal the Army never gave either of you. Elena took the dog tags with hands that had, 6 years earlier, tried and failed to hold a young man's life together on a rooftop halfway across the world, and for the first time since she had walked away from that mission, something in her chest that had been locked shut for a very long time finally, quietly, began to loosen. Marvin Ferris, standing awkwardly in the doorway, cleared his throat. I think, he said slowly, I owe you an apology, Ms. Voss. Several, actually. You didn't know, Elena said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, a small, genuine laugh breaking through the tears. Nobody was supposed to know. That was rather the entire point. Aaron Wexler looked around the library annex, at the plywood-patched ceiling, the rows of quiet study tables, the particular unglamorous ordinariness of the room, where a woman who had once run some of the most dangerous missions in modern American military history now spent her days sorting late assignment slips. You built a good life here, he said, and there was no judgment in it at all, only something that sounded, unmistakably, like relief. I did, Elena agreed. It's quiet. I like quiet now. Good, Cole said. You earned quiet. But for what it's worth, Doc, there's not a single person from our old unit who wouldn't drop everything to answer if you ever needed us. That doesn't expire. Not after 6 years. Not after 60. He didn't salute her, not the way soldiers salute in ceremonies, because the world Elena Voss had come from had never operated on ceremony, and the 2 men understood that better than anyone else on earth could have. Instead, Cole Bishop simply extended his hand, and when Elena took it, he held it in both of his for a long moment, the same gesture that had once passed between operators on rooftops, and in helicopters, and in places that never appeared on any map, a gesture that meant more, in its plainness, than any formal salute ever could. Aaron Wexler lingered a moment longer than Cole, glancing once around the annex, at the plywood-patched ceiling and the rows of quiet study tables, before he spoke again. You should know something else, Elena. Jake's mother, Carol, she wrote to the unit every year on the anniversary, just to ask if anyone had heard anything about you, not angry letters. Never once angry. She just wanted to know you were okay. She used to say that whoever held her son's hand at the end deserved to know she didn't blame her, not for 1 second. He paused. I think she'd want to write to you herself, if you're willing. I can pass along an address, only if you want it. Elena nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and Aaron seemed to understand that the nod was answer enough. Marvin Ferris, still hovering by the doorway long after the conversation had turned personal enough that he probably should have stepped out, cleared his throat again. I'll leave you 3 to it, he said, and for once in 2 years, he left a room without needing the last word. Word of the two quiet visitors spread through Crestwood High in the vague, half-formed way rumors always did, when nobody could quite explain what they'd actually witnessed. And within a week, the story students told about Elena Voss had shifted from witness protection and secret spies into something closer to the truth, though never quite the whole of it, because the whole of it was never meant to be told. Coach Dwayne Pratt, who had spent 2 years joking about her paperback thrillers, found her in the annex a few days later and, with considerably less humor than usual, asked if she wanted help covering her Wednesday shift for a while, in case she needed the time. Elena thanked him and declined, because she didn't need the time anymore, not the way she once might have. Something about Cole Bishop's visit, about the dog tags now resting in the same drawer as her old emergency kit, had loosened a knot in her chest that 2 years of quiet library shifts had never quite managed to untie on their own. She found, in the weeks that followed, that she slept a little easier, that the old sounds which used to jolt her upright at 3 a.m. bothered her a little less, and that the weight she had carried alone for 6 years finally felt like something shared rather than something hidden. Danny Reyes came back to school 6 weeks later, walking slower than before, but walking, and the first thing he did was find Elena in the library annex and hand her a card his entire family had signed, including his cousin Cole, home on leave for exactly 4 days before shipping back out. Elena read it twice, then tucked it carefully into the same desk drawer where, 2 years earlier, she had first packed away a small emergency kit she'd told herself she would probably never need. Priya Anand, back on crutches and insufferably proud of the 6 screws now holding her leg together, took to spending her study hall periods at the table nearest Elena's, and one afternoon, working up the nerve she'd lacked the first time, asked quietly whether it was true that Ms. Voss had once been some kind of secret agent. Elena considered the question for a long moment, the same considering look she gave most things, and said only, "I worked for the government," the exact same sentence she'd given 2 years earlier, though this time, for reasons Priya couldn't quite name, it sounded less like a wall going up and more like the truth simply resting where it belonged. Priya grinned, satisfied with an answer that told her nothing and somehow everything at once, and went back to her homework without pushing further, which was, in its own small way, exactly the kind of respect Elena had spent 2 years hoping someone at Crestwood would eventually learn to give her. She kept working study hall duty after that, sitting at the same back table, facing the same door, and if the students who passed through her room noticed that she smiled, a little more easily now, none of them ever quite understood why, and Elena never once felt the need to explain it. If Elena's quiet strength and the unbreakable bond between soldiers who never stopped looking for her moved you today, hit that like button and share her story with someone who needs a reminder that the people who carry the heaviest histories often do it in complete silence. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories of hidden courage and the families forged in places most of us will never fully understand. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were sitting in that study hall the day the ceiling came down?